The United States government says climate change is already affecting the lives of Americans. A recent report prepared by some 300 global climate experts found the entire country is vulnerable to harsher winters and extreme heat waves in the summer. Just last month, the United Nations Climate Change Panel said greenhouse gas emissions are still rising and efforts to reduce them will need international action and cooperation. Climate experts say the world's top emitters are the United States and China. Joining us now from New York is Radley Horton. He's the lead author of the White House study on climate change for the Northeast. And from San Francisco, Barbara Finamore, the founder and director of the China program at the Natural Resources Defense Council. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Dr. Horton, let me start with you. You are one of the lead authors of this report. It is an update, so is it confirming what we already knew about climate change, or are we seeing new information being brought to light here?
So it's a little bit of both. This report is more comprehensive than any that we've had before, so it brings in some new perspectives we haven't seen before. Talking about things like how we have vulnerabilities in our cities, how interactions between different types of infrastructure make us more vulnerable. Things like the power grid getting knocked out, having impacts on human populations and transportation. But really, fundamentally, this report is a stronger statement about things we've already known. For the first time, we're saying that climate change not only is going to happen, but that it's already underway. We've seen about 8 inches of sea level rise globally in the last century. In the US, we've seen temperatures go up by about 1 degree Celsius almost. That seemingly small change has already led to twice as many record-breaking heat events as record-breaking cold events during the period from 2001 to 2012.
Barbara, what did you make of the report produced by the White House?
I think this report brings home something that we've already known, that climate change is not something that's going to happen at some future date, but that it's happening now, and that it's having increasingly severe impacts both on people's health and on the economy. Now, in 2012, the impacts on the economy from crop damage, flood damage, wildfires, and other climate change impacts came to about $140 billion in damage to the U.S. economy. Most of that was actually footed by the U.S. taxpayer. So I think this report is very important for bringing home the need for moving faster and more strongly on addressing climate change.
Right, Barbara, and those effects that you're talking about, not just in the United States, but in other parts of the world as well.
That's right. China did a similar report in 2012, a 710-page report on the impacts of climate change on China. And it found that China was one of the countries in the world most vulnerable to climate change in terms of threats to its food security and its water security and sea level rise along its very long coastline, where most of its population and economic development is located.
Dr. Horton, when we look at the main drivers of climate change here, I mean, we've heard various reasons being brought forward on why the Earth's temperature is going up, but 2 of them seem to stand out. That is the burning of coal and deforestation. Are these the 2 main drivers of climate change?
The 2 main drivers of climate change are burning of fossil fuels generally, and coal within that group of fossil fuels is the most carbon-intensive fuel. It's the place we can look to right away if we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions dramatically. So the first driver is the burning of fossil fuels, of which coal is extremely important. The second driver, less important, but still important, is changes in land cover, things like deforestation, what types of crops are being grown. We think that's responsible for about 1/5 of the warming that we've observed. The burning of fossil fuels, including coal, is a bigger driver for the climate changes we've seen since the Industrial Revolution about 200 years ago.
Barbara, I want to go to you now and to another part of the world. You've spent quite a bit of time in China starting a clean energy project there with the Natural Resources Defense Council. Tell us what that group has accomplished.
We have been very active in helping China achieve its ambitious goals on energy efficiency, renewable energy, and climate reduction. And most recently, we have been focusing a lot on helping China to reduce the choking levels of air pollution that are killing 1.2 million people each year in China.
Dr. Horton, I just want to get back to some figures that we're seeing in these reports. We know that since 1895, temperatures have on average, risen by 1.5%, but 80% of that rise took place since 1980, and we're now hearing about predictions that the temperature could go up by as much as 2 degrees in the next few decades. What kind of impact is such a rise going to have?
So one of the things we've really learned recently is that seemingly small changes in climate can have big impacts on our human societies, our agriculture, our coastal cities and infrastructure. Just to give you a few examples, sea level rise of about 2 feet, roughly 0.6 meters, doesn't sound like a lot, but even if storms don't get any stronger, just having that higher baseline of sea level is going to make coastal flooding something that experiences about 3 times as often. It's also going to mean as temperatures get a little bit higher, that our populations in our cities around the world are much more vulnerable. You put that together with the air quality issues in parts of the US and especially China, and you have additional vulnerability. Just to give another example, when we look at the water issues, looking to China, looking, for example, to some of the glaciers that hold so much critical water, as those begin to melt increasingly in the future, it's going to lead to water supply issues. As temperatures go up throughout China, you're going to have more evaporation, and it's going to make some of those water supply issues more challenging at the same time that agricultural yields may suffer due to lower water amounts.
Barbara, getting back to China again, the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang has issued what he called a war on pollution. Explain what that means. I mean, are there going to be penalties, for instance, for people who pollute too much?
Yes, China has declared a war on pollution and is moving quickly with new standards, new laws, new penalties, new prohibitions on new coal-fired power plants, and the like that are designed to reduce the air pollution that is threatening everybody throughout the country. But it's important, I think, for China to recognize that although much of what it does to reduce air pollution in China will also help in reducing its CO2 emissions, it has to avoid situations where one is pitted against the other. And I'm talking now about the fact that even though China has begun to kick its addiction to coal, it's now the coal industry is promoting vast new coal-to-gas power plants in the northern and western part of the country that would help to reduce air pollution, but also greatly increase CO2 emissions. So we hope that China will seriously consider this. There's been a study by a group of top Chinese and US energy experts that found that China can, with very, very strong efforts and investment in energy efficiency, meet 80% of its energy demand in 2050 by clean renewable energy, with the remainder natural gas, and not rely on coal power at all.
Dr. Horton, what kind of effect is climate change going to have on food production, or food security as it's sometimes called? I mean, we know that there are now longer droughts, and we're also seeing more wildfires and more flooding.
Yeah, so when we look at how climate change is going to impact agriculture, it's a complicated story in the next couple decades, but as we get further on in time, it looks like agricultural yields are really going to suffer around the world in a lot of places. Some of the things we need to think about are, what are higher temperatures going to mean for crops? Some crops already are up against sort of the thresholds of how hot temperatures they can handle. Temperatures go higher, those crops suffer. Additionally, in the future, if we see less rainfall in some of the areas that are water limited now, that's going to be a major issue for crops as well. Other things we have to think about: what's going to happen to weeds? What's going to happen to some of the pests that eat a lot of these crops? Some studies suggest that as carbon dioxide levels rise, as temperatures rise, some of those pests and weeds may do better than the crops, which will pose more and more of a challenge for crop yields in the future.
Okay. Barbara, both the Chinese and the US governments have vowed to work together to address climate change. I mean, addressing things like emission reductions as well as more energy efficient buildings. Have we seen evidence of this?
This is a very positive development. The US and China for many years have been at odds in the international climate negotiations, but over the past year, we've seen a sea change where the two countries have begun to work together in a constructive, cooperative way on things like improving energy efficiency in buildings and industry, building a smart grid that will reduce coal pollution from power plants and reducing CO2 emissions from heavy industry, heavy vehicles. And so this is a very positive development that we think can then carry over to the international climate development, but also in and of itself will help to reduce CO2 pollution, carbon pollution from the world's two largest emitters.
Okay, Dr. Horton, I want to address an issue now which actually falls outside the realm of climate change science, and that is the fact that this has become a political issue. It's being used as a political football by both parties here in the United States. And I'm wondering, how concerned are you that climate change could fall victim to this kind of party politics?
Yeah, well, one of the strengths of this latest national climate assessment is that it brought together voices from across America. 300 authors, some were scientists, some were representatives of the private sector, fossil fuel companies, and then public sector too. All those voices really were making the point that climate risks are going up as temperatures rise, as sea levels rise. And I think when we think towards the future and look at this range of solutions that we're starting to hear about, that we just heard alluded to, ways to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, ways to adapt to some of these climate changes that are coming. When we look at that broad range of strategies, I think it's going to help people while they're simultaneously learning more about how vulnerable they may be, how the climate's changing, to say, there's a range of solutions out here. And I think they may increasingly demand of their political leaders that they help to address, reduce these vulnerabilities so that we make sound investments in the future, so that we can pick places to live where we're safe, where our children are safe. When people are looking to their political leaders, they're not going to be asking, are you Democrat or Republican? They're going to be asking, are you can take steps to make us less vulnerable in the future and to reduce the amount of warming that we see in the first place.
Dr. Radley Horton, Barbara Finamore, thanks to both of you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Torrential rains, wildfires, and drought. A recent report finds climate change is already impacting the planet. Next, we'll continue our discussion with an educator and also talk with a climate change skeptic. Stay with us, you're on The Heat.